Welcome back, Fearless listeners, to another episode of Fearless Journeys Thriving in College. I'm your host, Corinne, and I'm joined by my co-host, Steve.
Hey, everyone. It's great to be here again discussing important topics for our college students.
Absolutely, Steve. And today we have a crucial topic to dive into: cultivating healthy romantic relationships in college with a focus on communication and consent.
Yeah, that's right. College is really a time when many students explore relationships, and it's essential really to do so in a healthy and respectful way.
Yeah, and to help us navigate this topic, we have a fantastic expert with us today. Please welcome Mike Sagan.
That works. Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Mm-hmm.
You want to give us a short bio of who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm an addiction counselor, counseling therapist by trade, currently a master's student in the counseling psychology program at the University of Lethbridge, working towards hopeful registration as a psychologist one day. Moved to Alberta in 2016 from BC. I grew up in a small skiing town, so this is a little bit different for me, being in the prairies and a little bit flatter. Yeah, I really, I don't know what to say. I've never actually talked about myself.
Oh, it's always a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. I've been working in addiction to mental health for 7 years now.
Okay.
On and off. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
Yes, I'm sure it's an interesting topic to manage to deal with as well.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Where in BC?
I'm from Kimberley.
Kimberley, okay. Close by.
Mm-hmm.
Very close. So it's a quick trip back, so I can still get some good skiing in every now and then.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're really thrilled to have you here, Mike. Let's start with some of the basics. So why is cultivating healthy romantic relationships in college so crucial?
Yeah, so I look at, relationships in general are pivotal to us. As humans, we're social beings, right? We need that connection. We need to have that sense of community and belonging. I think when I look at romantic relationships, especially in college, I break it down into a little bit of sections. For one, there's, the human connection component to it, accountability, self-awareness, conflict management, and learning some life lessons, right? And so when I look at human connection, there's actually been some studies that show romantic relationship in college actually improve overall academic support. You build a sense of belonging with others. You kind of find that area where, not necessarily where you fit, but where you belong.
Right.
Brene Brown talks about fitting in and how actually fitting in can be detrimental to belonging because we want to be accepted in a way that others accept us.
Yes.
And instead of falling into our true sense of self. And when we look at healthy relationships, it's a way to be able to build trust and stability. And it does increase that sense of belonging. The accountability part provides motivation for those higher levels of engagement. Often if I'm accountable to more than myself, I might have a bit more motivation to try to maybe put my full effort in or show up on days when I don't want to show up.
Yeah, that's always a tricky one with college students.
Yeah, the self-awareness part is kind of learning about yourself, right? College can be tricky to navigate on your own. And so being able to learn things that you wouldn't normally learn on your own. Relationships are going to bring out parts of yourself that you never knew existed.
Right. It's kind of that growth piece to yourself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You're going to show fears and insecurities and attachment things, and there's going to be a lot of stuff that you didn't know was underlying, right? And it's a part of exploration, the internal part, and then the external factor as well. One of the things that I feel like relationships in any post-secondary setting helps build is that conflict management around rupture and repair, right? Often we think that ruptures can be kind of a be-all, end-all situation, and then sometimes people will compromise so they don't upset the other person, they don't cause a rupture. But it gives us healthy tools to be able to address areas where we need to grow, maybe drop my ego a little bit and then say, hey, I'm wrong, that was a mistake.
Yeah.
And rebuild a rupture to where it's going to be repaired and be a bit stronger, right? It also helps you with some active listening skills. What's actually going on? How am I communicating? All of that plays into life skills down the road that you can implement not only in other relationships, but within the professional and academic setting.
Yeah. And I think when we're speaking about college age students, I think sometimes we focus on that 18 to 25 kind of typical age group. Do you think there's any difference if we're going, let's say, to an older age group, 25 to 35 or something?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that life experience in general is going to play a huge factor in the importance and the outcome of some of these relationships. Someone who's in a older age group may have a bit more life experience, and that could be a bit of an assumption because maybe they don't. But they may have been around within society and community and culture enough to pick up some of the, I guess, patterns that we have and understand it a little bit better than someone in a younger age group, right? Where it's kind of a first time learning process. That doesn't mean that the weight is going to be any different, right? The accountability, the sense of belonging is still going to be important and still going to be there, but they may have a better sense of themselves, or at least understand some of their own responses and reactions, or what they get emotionally charged to.
Let's jump right into our first topic, communication. How can college students improve their communication in romantic relationships?
Yeah, when I look at communication, I think firstly we need to understand what is effective communication. What are communication styles and types, and maybe what's my default. We look at it, and when I teach communication skills, we look at, the 4 types of it. We have passive, passive-aggressive, aggressive, and assertive communication styles. We all use each one of those within our days and within our lives, but we have a default one that we go to no matter what.
Right.
Often that's learned behavior, right? That's a pattern that we've adopted, and it's a response that we have found out meets a need, right? It gets us what we want. If we don't know how to communicate or what communication styles there are, we're never going to be effective on really recognizing things, right? It's funny, people always talk about communication being the most important aspect of a relationship. You also have to have comprehension,
right,
and context, right? So if the context for engaging in a conversation isn't appropriate, it's not going to be comprehended in the way that you want, right? Or if I'm stressed out, I've had a rough day, or my partner comes home from work and she's had a really rough day, the message that I'm sending may not be received accurately. Maybe I'm not in a place to send it the way that I want to.
Right.
Right. So there's not going to be a comprehension there. I think really working on these skills and kind of understanding your default is the first step to having a foundation for effective communication.
And I think a lot of times we're going from, high school to college, and our communication styles are quite different in high school and then coming into college with a whole bunch more students that are different age groups, and we're actually communicating with instructors. And so communication then is very interesting in how we start to learn about how we do it with romantic partners.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point in recognizing that there's going to be such a larger diverse population that we communicate with on different levels, whether it's academic, professional, through peer groups and just friendship and that type of communication, to intimate and romantic relationships. I find one of the biggest things, especially in romantic relationships around communication, is we often listen to respond and not listen to hear.
Right.
The other person might be expressing their day or talking about a need they have, or really just speaking their truth, but I'm already focused on what I'm going to respond with at the end, so I'm not really listening.
Right.
I'm hearing them, I'm just letting them run through the topics, but I'm not paying attention. Right. And so actually listening to hear what that person is saying is going to give you more of an understanding of what they're actually trying to communicate. Again, not only looking at the words, but what's their body language telling me? What's the tone and cadence of their speech, right? The underlying messages, because that's going to be more than what the words are.
That whole active listening part, I wonder if it's probably one of those things that we should actually have a course in before people come into college.
Absolutely. I mean, to be able to active listen, it's a skill that you have to practice, right? Like you have to constantly engage in and be focused in the present moment and say, okay, what is this person actually saying? Is it accurate? Am I hearing the message appropriately, or do I have a preconceived perception? Right? Because often we can make up our own narratives around what somebody means and what they're saying, and that's not accurate at all.
Yeah, we see that quite a bit.
Yeah.
Well, and especially with romantic relationships, there's always a fear of, I don't want to offend someone, right? I don't want to say something wrong to make them mad. I mean, that goes into a whole feelings area where we can't actually make people feel certain ways.
Right.
That's a whole different conversation, but it restricts us in speaking our truth, right? It restricts us from actually expressing what we need, wants, desires, things like that to make the relationship function, because of the fear of what if they leave, right? There's an abandonment part, which usually plays to more of like an underlying attachment, right? And so a lot of those patterns and those beliefs will come out in communication form.
And what about communication in, I'm not really sure how to say this, typical students? What if we have a student who has trouble reading social cues? So when we're looking at romantic relationships between two people and one of them struggles with those social cues, how does that play out? Is there any ideas or tips that you might have to kind of help that person?
Yeah, that's actually interesting because over the last couple of years, especially with COVID and kind of a change in dynamic on how services have been delivered and just social engagement in general, I've noticed seeing, individuals that have maybe a decreased skill set when it comes to engaging in social settings or being able to pick up on social cues. And, that translates into a lower sense of self-confidence, often tied to a lower sense of self-worth, right? And they start to identify and internalize a lot of that. And so if you're one of those individuals that maybe feel awkward in social settings or struggle a bit to kind of communicate effectively, in order to actually get better at these skills, we have to make mistakes.
Right.
Right. And I would encourage mistakes, right? They're healthy, and to not shame yourself over them. And then to address it if you do make a mistake, because that's the social engagement part is being able to communicate and say, that was wrong, right? Or I apologize for this. That's going to teach you what you need to know better than just people watching.
Yeah, I don't think I've learned that, Corinne, since, I've been married for a long, long time, and I don't think I've learned that quite completely yet.
No, it's an ever evolving skill.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about consent? So how can college students ensure that consent is always present in their relationship?
Yeah, so when I look at consent, it's kind of a two-part, I think. Well, more than that, but I can kind of simplify it a little bit more. We need to understand and acknowledge that consent needs to be discussed ahead of time.
Right.
Right? It's one of those things that both parties need to agree on, whatever the expectations or outcomes of the interaction is going to be. We also need to understand that there's a difference between giving permission and having consent. Permission, can be just defined roughly as, giving approval for somebody to engage in something, right? And this can apply to both kind of short-term and long-term interactions. Consent has more weight, right, to the word. There's a legal part to it as well,
right,
in that aspect. And, when I think about consent, even from a therapeutic standpoint, if I do informed consent with my client, they need to know everything that goes on within the counseling session. What is the entire interaction going to be like? Confidentiality, limits of disclosure, safety checks. Will therapy be uncomfortable? What will interventions look like? How do I pay? Right? When can I contact you? All of these things. To give consent, you have to fully understand the entire scope of the situation. With permission, if I were to omit any of those, they're not giving consent, they're giving like an assent. Right? It's just more of a informed permission type thing, but they're not fully aware.
Right.
Consent's ongoing, right? And so whenever you are in a relationship and maybe you try something new, you're going to engage in something different, or you just want to ask for that permission aspect, to fully understand what's the whole outcome. What are the expectations, right? Is there anything I need to know that you're not telling me? What are potential risks? Right. Because consent often revolves around exposure and vulnerability, usually intimate situations where there's an increased probability for risk, right? Which is why it has kind of that legal weight behind it. It's all about the communication and respect, right, between the parties, to constantly ask for it, to always have that on your mind. I've been with my wife now 7 years. We still talk about consent all the time, and it's something we teach, to our daughter and to anybody that we come kind of interact with. You need to be aware of it, right? If you don't understand it, again, you can't really talk about it.
Right. And in a relationship, we kind of look at those boundary pieces, right? And that's part of that consent.
Yeah. And, with consent, it's understanding your boundaries, and those boundaries are to protect you, right? My morals, my values, my safety, they're not for anybody else, and with boundaries, there's going to be an outcome to something that I am in control of, right? If you do something, I'm going to do this, right? I might leave, or if you don't treat me with respect, I'm going to end this relationship and I'm going to step away. I'm not telling you what to do, but I'm going to tell you what the outcome is if you don't follow it. That's consent. You know it. Right now, you have a conscious choice.
Right.
right? You can make that decision on your own.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that in romantic relationships, in college age students, let's say, that the boundaries, the talk about boundaries and like you said, you mentioned the reciprocation of crossing those boundaries? Do you find that this age population has difficulty in actually identifying maybe some of those boundaries?
Yes, I think boundaries are something that you develop over time as well at different stages of life, right? I think about my life, and boundaries that I might have had when I was a teenager in my 20s are completely different than boundaries that I have now. Maybe I didn't even know what a boundary was at
Right.
that point, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Often people will mistake statements for a boundary, right? Well, I said you couldn't do this. I set a boundary. Well, you told me a statement, right? There's room for interpretation.
Yes.
Boundaries, you need to be able to understand yourself. You have to have a good relationship with who you are, know your morals, values, the direction I want to go, what I want and don't want out of life, or what I want and don't want in a partner,
Mm-hmm.
right? In order to be able to establish those boundaries, what are my limits,
Mm-hmm.
right? Boundaries can also change based off of your own value, right? Your own learning. And they don't have to be something that once you set it, if you've learned new information or you've grown in a certain way, that you can't readjust, right? You can revisit that all the time. And I think it's one of the big things that often gets overlooked in relationships, is that it's an ever evolving process,
Yeah.
right? Because who you are today is not who you're going to be next week.
Or a year from now, or 2
Mm-hmm.
years from now. Right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
right? You're going to be at a different stage, and you're going to look at things differently, right?
Yeah.
It's just about that growth. I also think that when we look at consent, it's really important to address that no is a complete sentence. There's no need for justifying.
Yep.
There's no need for trying to explain, right? Once you have said no,
Mm-hmm.
you've revoked consent.
Yeah. That's a
And,
good point.
and there's no need to explain.
Yeah.
It's a complete sentence. I can just say, no, I don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
Can we add to that too, like that no piece? It's not necessarily about the other person. Like sometimes when we hear no, we take it personally and we're like, well, why? Like, what's wrong with me? But it's not always that. It's about the boundaries that we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's usually I'm not feeling comfortable in a certain situation. And that's my own internal process. It might not have anything to do with the other person, but I just don't want to be here right now.
Mm-hmm.
We often, like you said, internalize that though, right? What's wrong with me? That's going to hit those core wounds. Because again, when we're engaged in a romantic or an intimate relationship, especially when we're young and we don't really know a lot in the scheme of things, we internalize every form of criticism, right? It's really hard to separate that this isn't me, it's this kind of next to me, externalized outside of myself.
Yeah.
And not to take it personally, right? Because what the other person says or does or how they react, usually, unless it's something done in ill attempt, has nothing to do with you, right? And so why take that on?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that goes to, like you were speaking about the vulnerability of being in a relationship, communicating, consent. So that vulnerability, we automatically take offense to that no or internalize that. So keeping that in mind too, like we're in a vulnerable space, step back a moment. It's not about us. And then try to respond, maybe.
No, absolutely. And when I look at vulnerability, I'm an attachment-based therapist as well. So I look at relationships growing up in developmental stages and what our attachment styles are like in our attachment systems. And so if we've had something that's been disorganized or an insecure attachment, we're going to have a wound, right? The emotional response to the event is going to show up everywhere else in life, usually around attachment to others. So in a relationship, if something triggers a memory that brings up that same emotion, I'm no longer thinking about the event in front of me. I'm responding based off of my reaction to an event in the past.
Right.
Right. And that's what's dictating how I manage the current situation. It has nothing to do with the actual situation in hand. I'm just having an emotional response.
Yeah, it makes it very interesting how people then relate in a relationship.
Oh, absolutely. And when you're with someone in a relationship in an intimate manner, you're going to bring out more childhood wounds and insecurities and vulnerabilities than you realize, right? Your spouse will trigger that and bring those to awareness in ways that you had no idea existed.
Yeah.
Right. But it gives you a chance to look at it if you're aware and you're open to doing the work. Usually, I know in my 20s, I wasn't. Makes it really hard. right? And so if a relationship ends, well, I'm going to take that hard. That's me. It wasn't the problem. It's not the problem. I am the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is speaking to a whole different level of wound.
Yeah. And you get that self-awareness piece.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so since we've been talking about consent quite a bit, we just want to define what it is. And a really great way to think about consent is using the FRIES acronym. So the F stands for freely given, the R is reversible, the I is informed, like you were talking about, Mike, the E is enthusiastic, so it's an enthusiastic yes, and then specific. So specific yes to one thing. Just because we're saying yes to one thing doesn't mean that we're saying yes to other things. So it's really specific. So thinking about that acronym when we think about consent. Another thing that I want to add around consent is we are talking in romantic relationships, but it's something that's in all of our relationships. So thinking about our friendships, our families. Maybe we are a person who loves hugs, but that doesn't mean that the people we're in relationships love hugs as well. So we get consent for that too. So it's about bodily autonomy. Anything to add to that?
I think sometimes we also have to be realistic and know that when we're talking about young relationships, college age students in romance, we're often talking about sexual activity.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we're thinking about consent, we do have to have that enthusiastic yes.
Yeah.
And we do have to remember that the influence of alcohol and drugs, right, you cannot give consent under the influence.
Yeah.
And we see a lot of drinking.
Yeah. Well, and two, like that enthusiastic yes, but we can also take into account body language. So paying attention to the person we're engaging in activities with, how their bodies are responding.
Yeah, and when you look at communication, I think like 7% of all communication is actually spoken word,
Right.
The message I'm actually delivering, where I think like 60% or even more, maybe 70% is body language. How am I displaying, how am I presenting during this interaction? Am I facing you? Am I open? Am I engaged? Or am I closed off and kind of turned away? And right, that's going to tell you more about what's actually happening than anything I can say, right? And so being aware and learning how to read body language and how to understand that and what the messages mean, right? Again, we only know what we know. They talk about, knowledge being power, but really it's understanding and having that knowledge and awareness and even the desire to say, maybe I don't know about this, I'm going to learn more, right? I want to show up the best way I can, right? And that's for me, right? So that even if I'm in a situation, I know exactly where my limits are, what my rights are, how to voice and express my concerns, but also be a little bit more in tune with others, right? And that all goes to kind of that reciprocity and just wanting to participate.
Yeah. And I like the point that you also made that when we're talking about consent, it's always good to have that conversation beforehand, right? Because we want partners to feel safe and respected. We want our partners to feel that way. So having that beforehand makes so much sense.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, like when we look at college age students, a lot of them, a lot of the activities are going to be sexual in nature. Part of that consent can be asking about safety screening, STI checking.
Right.
When were you last tested? If somebody doesn't want to disclose that, then I'm not going to give consent.
Right.
Right. That's all part of it. And that should be understood on both sides for both parties, right? Whatever I'm asking, I have to assume can also be asked to me. So I have to be willing to answer or provide the information, right? That's also the part of consent is not a one-way street.
Now, Mike, let's talk about some common challenges college students may face in their romantic relationships. What are some red flags they should be aware of?
I mean, there's some of the definitive big red flags, right? Any forms of abuse, right? Whether it be physical, emotional, psychological, those are kind of the big ones that people default to. Instantly, any form of that is a red flag. There's also financial abuse, right? Say you're in a relationship, and this could be maybe even more for long-term partnerships where you're not really that happy, but you can't afford to leave, and maybe you're not in control of the finances and the other person is, but they kind of dictate where and when they spend and kind of keep you involved because of that, right? So there's a bit of a financial entrapment to it. A lot of these are instances or experiences that kind of get overlooked a lot of the time, and when I do work with, intimate partner violence or family violence programs, often the biggest part of it, there is the physical and kind of the sexual abuse components of it. emotional and psychological. Psychological safety is a kind of a realm that often doesn't have the same weight to it as some of the others, but can have, in my mind, almost, similar or more impactful damage because it plays into everything, right? If I'm not feeling well psychologically, I'm not going to be in a place to be able to express my needs or verbalize things. And so I might put myself at more risk or be susceptible to other forms of abuse because what's the point, right?
Right.
Why speak up?
Yeah.
Looking at kind of the interaction within the relationship, some of the other red flags can be, do they support you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Do you uplift each other in your goals? Do you hold yourselves accountable in healthy ways? Or is there a lot of toxicity? Do I feel comfortable expressing my truth and being honest? Or do I have to walk on eggshells? That's a big one.
It is, yeah.
Right? And that could be a red flag that I'm putting off too, because maybe I have my own insecurities or maybe my own wounds where I don't want to do that, but I'm also doing an injustice to the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there could be red flags kind of on both sides of it, but how am I impacting that as well?
Mm-hmm.
Minimizing emotional responses, not feeling heard or validated, little cues that show maybe I'm not engaged in this. Or if I've expressed my needs and that person says, yeah, I'm totally going to do this. Well, if they don't, right, and they show a pattern that's different, you have to have a conversation, right? Where are they invested? Right? Where's the priority? Talking behind your back, any sort of triangulation, and going to friends and hearing from other people things that might have happened rather than from the source,
Mm-hmm.
right? All of those things kind of tell me that there needs to be some work. And that doesn't mean it can't be repaired. It just needs to be addressed,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe it can't be repaired eventually, but you don't know until you bring it up.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds, as a summary to that, feels like it's two parts, right? It's that red flag of abuse and red flag of some kind of controlling behavior.
Mm-hmm. And when I think about control and power dynamics, where am I giving up control and allowing somebody else to have it? And where they may be overstepping boundaries or constantly pushing the limits to try to gain it, right? And is there a power over or a power under type of dynamic, or are we on level playing fields, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because relationships are partnerships.
Right.
It's not, again, Brene Brown talks about vulnerability in partnerships. It's not ever 50-50, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some days it's 80-20, but you collectively make that 100% within
Mm-hmm.
that partnership. It depends on your day. But if there's a power over, power under dynamic, then there's a hierarchy, right? And you've now placed somebody else up on a pedestal.
Right.
So in doing that, I'm less than, right? And so I'm already internalizing. I'm already being passive in how I interact, right? The path of least resistance,
Mm-hmm.
right? I don't want to make them upset. And that's not healthy.
Mm-hmm. So part of what you said, you mentioned briefly about your own part of it, of this red flag. So how do we look at ourselves as, hey, this is a red flag in my personality that maybe I need to change, and how do I recognize that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a little bit easier said than done.
Mm-hmm.
First, you can't look at anything that we're not aware of,
Right.
right? Awareness is kind of the key to instilling any form of change. Curiosity leads into awareness, though, right? So if something isn't going correct in my relationship, or whether it's a romantic one or any relationship, what's my influence in this, right? Not what's in my control, because we don't really have control over anything, but what can I influence, or how have I influenced this outcome? I'm going to start asking myself these questions, but I have to be willing to face the answer.
Right.
Right.
That's the tricky one.
I have to be willing to drop my ego, admit that I'm wrong, or admit that maybe I have some faults that I never looked at before, and I can be okay with fixing, right? And a lot of that is my own internal process. Is if I admit a fault, then there's a deeper level that I have to go,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have to want things to get better and be willing to look at all options.
Yeah. And Corinne, I think we see that in the sense of, we don't see that self-awareness until that crisis happens,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so
Yeah.
we hear from students at that crisis moment,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And then they start to, or we can help them start to look at that self-awareness piece.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you say the crisis part, because we're often very reactive
Mm-hmm.
in our responses to things rather than taking the proactive approach.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I work with clients, I always use the acronym HOW, right? Honest, open, and willing. And there's a difference between being honest and truthful, right? I need to be honest with myself. I can be truthful with others. But it's that that honesty with yourself. Can I look in the mirror and actually, align with what I'm living, align with the values? Am I being congruent? Or are there differences,
Mm-hmm.
right? Can I be open to new ways of learning, and can I be willing to engage and try something different, right? Often we think, well, if I try this, then I'm moving down here and that's going to be it. I can always go back to old patterns. They're always going to be there. And so if this new road doesn't work, well, I can just default, right? That's not going anywhere.
Right.
What's the harm in trying though,
Mm-hmm.
right? Maybe it gets better, but maybe there's fear,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of the what if, the uncertainty. Often a lot of patterns or chaos, or if we find, even some of the red flags, maybe it's constant argument. Those can also be a way to find comfort when there's uncertainty, right? I need to engage my nervous system in a way to where my baseline feels like it's in chaos again, because that's what I normally live in.
Right.
And it provides an illusion of control
Mm-hmm.
when everything else around me seems like it's falling apart. So I might actually start an argument to feel normal,
Mm-hmm.
quote unquote.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's that kind of a learned response sometimes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You learn as you grow, and that's how you process things.
Yeah. And it's a pattern that, we've had most of our lives normally. It's given us a way to meet a need, or it's been a protective factor
Mm-hmm.
at some point in our life. It just may not be healthy anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really good information. You mentioned support and having certain supports. So, what resources do you think may be available to college students to help them kind of navigate the relationships and consent?
Yeah. So I know most post-secondary institutions will have, counseling supports, mental health, addictions, even just generalized counseling, sexual wellness supports and education seminars. There might be information booths or other resources you can access. Maybe there's mandatory training you have to go through, or you have to complete, a certain amount of training in order to register for classes now.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to provide information on kind of the overarching instances that we're experiencing. Talking to your peers, right? Engaging in social settings.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's more supports that are specific to each kind of institution, but there's also community supports as well that you can access. There's different apps for things. And, it's one of those things where we're kind of seeing a shift in how people interact within post-secondary as well. And not just that, but kind of in society. And we look at instances of consent being violated or breached. And there was, I think, a recent study in 2021. And out of the people surveyed, 33% of females said they had experienced a event of violation.
Mm-hmm.
16% of males did.
Right.
That's highly underreported.
Yes.
Right. That's only based off of the people who are willing to participate in the survey. I guarantee that's probably 60% less than what the actual reporting would be.
I'm sure it is.
Because most people don't want to speak up about it, but they also don't know what's available for supports or who's going to believe me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Community supports around addiction and mental health, or sexual assault centers, trauma specialists.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this are accessible to not only community members, but students as well. And maybe you can speak more specifically to what you have at the college. I'm sure you have a lot of supports here that are available.
Mm-hmm. Corinne, what might some of those supports be?
So just like you mentioned, Mike, we do have counseling, and it is for mental health, addictions, and anything else a student's struggling with. So stress, relationships, that kind of thing. We also have our gender-based and sexual violence student support advisor. So if someone's had an experience of gender-based sexual violence, they can connect with that person. Her name is Linda in our office. Her email is gbssupport@lethbridgecollege.ca. And that can be, you can email asking questions about things like, is this, or I had this experience, I don't know what to do about it. And she can support students in that way. We do have education pieces as well. So we are doing a lot of education around our gender-based sexual violence policy, because it has been updated. And then we also have some new supports around that. So our REIS, the website that students can go to write their story if they've had an experience, and then if they choose to connect with various supports like Linda or our conduct officer or the police, if that is something a student wants. And then within our community, we have a number of supports around healthy relationships around gender-based sexual violence. So healthy relationship support could be the YWCA, could be other counseling agencies and supports in our community. And then if someone's had an experience with sexual violence, we have the Chinook Sexual Assault Center and then the Child Advocate Center with Chinook as well. So those are two supports that people can access. And with those supports, it is what the survivor wants. So they can connect just to share their story, learn what supports they can get. They can also have that support navigating what they want to do next. So, yeah. Can you think of any others?
One thing that I'd like to mention too is our Lethbridge College Student Association put on a lot of activities, and it really helps, one, build connections among students, which is great. And again, there's that peer support part of it, right, that they're doing. And a lot of education. So when they put on events, oftentimes there's educational pieces that may talk about consent, may talk about romantic relationships. So I think that's a good support for students to look at. There are workshops, there's different activities that go on in colleges. And of course, our LCSA here in Lethbridge College is great for that. We also have to think, you mentioned apps, there's also national hotlines that we can access. And there's sometimes so many supports that we just don't know sometimes where to start. Mm-hmm. And we have to think family and friends, who's your big supporter? Who's the emotional support? Of course, hopefully not somebody who's, like you said before, trying to fix the problem, mm-hmm. right? But somebody who can listen to you.
Mm-hmm. Can I highlight a couple of online supports?
Yes.
So one specific to healthy relationship, it's called Love is Respect, and that's loveisrespect.org. They have information about dating, healthy relationships, personal safety, the relationship continuum. So looking at, like you were talking about earlier, Mike, healthy relationship, unhealthy relationship, and abusive situation. So looking at that spectrum, looking at what those look like. In an unhealthy relationship, we can move towards that healthy relationship. In an abuse situation, that's about that power dynamic. So that's not really a relationship. And that's one of those red flags we were talking about. Another support that I'd like to highlight is the Kids Help Phone. So they do have information on healthy relationships as well as other mental health stuff. And I know it says Kids Help Phone, but they are a support for people 13 to like 25 or 30.
I believe 25.
So even if you're not within that age range, they really have good information on their website. So definitely worth checking out.
I also think it's important to mention that some of the things that we've talked about today, though, some of the stats, especially around intimate partner violence, are very gender specific.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this is inclusive to any relationship,
mm-hmm.
right? And I like how you mentioned that it's a spectrum,
mm-hmm.
right? I can be in an abusive relationship, and that's not a relationship,
mm-hmm.
right? Anymore. That's about a power control and a dynamic that doesn't benefit me. It only benefits one party.
Mm-hmm.
But I can be in an unhealthy relationship and move towards a healthy
mm-hmm.
relationship if I do the work.
Mm-hmm.
It's also important to know that a lot of the instances of, exposure to traumatic events or intimate partner violence or any of these violating situations are going to be increased when you're, of a demographic or a minority population,
mm-hmm.
right? And so to be aware that there are those increased risks and there are supports that are specific to that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important that students are at least aware, right, that there are supports out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's information out there about healthy relationships and how that looks. Hopefully they'll all listen to this and take something from it. But students are going to have romantic relationships in college,
mm-hmm.
And that communication piece is essential. That consent piece is essential.
All right, fantastic. It is crucial for college students to know where to turn for help if needed. Mike, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, just that, this is an exploration stage of your life, right? We go through different life stages or different chapters. And though there can be a lot of repercussions if things aren't done appropriately, to also not have a lot of fear around exploring and learning about yourself, right? To make mistakes, to have these small ruptures so that you can learn how to repair them. That's healthy. Any relationship that has healthy ruptures, maybe arguments or disagreements back and forth, I encourage that, because to me it means that you're both being honest, right? Because if you never have an argument, one person is lying.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
One person isn't being honest or expressing what they need or their wants or their desires. and is more kind of catering to the other person, right? To avoid that conflict. Conflict can be good, right? And it can be healthy in ways if we use it appropriately. It doesn't have to be something that we avoid. And you can't have a good relationship with others or be fully invested if you don't have a good relationship with yourself, right? So part of that exploration is the internal work around what do I want? What's my morals, my values? What do I enjoy? What do I not enjoy? What do I want in a partner? How do I get to know myself? Because if I don't, I can't really be good to my partner.
Right.
Right. And to never really compromise your beliefs, right? Don't compromise yourself, your morals, your values, just to try to fit in somewhere. Because we want a sense of belonging, not just to fit in. And if we're fitting in, then we're not being our authentic self. And I mean, that's almost like a false advertising if I'm in a relationship and I'm not being authentic, but that person is attracted to who they think they're seeing.
Right.
But that might not actually be me.
Yeah.
Right. I might be conforming to a role that I think I need to play. Right. And to really understand that sometimes people are only meant to be in our lives for certain chapters, right? For a brief moment.
Yeah.
And it's okay to outgrow someone. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a natural progression. Take what you learned and your experiences from that time, bring it forward, right? But don't stay somewhere or remain stagnant because you're finding that it's easier to just kind of conform, right? And compromise. You can outgrow someone, that's fine. And it has nothing to do with, it may not have anything to do with beliefs or anything. It's just a different direction. And that's fine, right? There's a learning experience in everything.
Yeah.
So I would encourage, mistakes, focus on healthy listening, talk to your partner, learn about yourself, and really just reflect on what you want in life. And does this partnership, help push me towards that? Does it direct me towards growth, or is it hindering me?
Well, thank you, Mike, for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this critical topic.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Fearless Journeys Thriving in College. We hope you found our discussion on cultivating healthy relationships, focusing on communication and consent, both insightful and empowering.
Remember, fearless listeners, the journey through college is an incredible adventure. It's filled with opportunities for growth, and it's really up to you to make the most of it.
So as you navigate your own college journey, we encourage you to put into practice what we've discussed today. Communicate openly, prioritize consent, and always respect your boundaries and those of your partner.
Please share this episode with your friends and peers. Let's spread the knowledge and promote healthy relationships on college campuses everywhere.
And if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to explore in the future, subscribe and reach out by email.
Until next time, stay fearless and thrive in your college journey.